Hi, and welcome to Gin with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne, and this is where we talk about data, marketing, and philosophy. This week, I've been thinking about waiting and how we all hate to wait. Or maybe we don't. Here are three stories about companies that have dealt with unhappy customers who were complaining about waiting and how they dealt with the problem. You might have noticed a change in scenery from my fake virtual library to now a fake virtual elevator, because what story is more exciting than talking about elevators, or as I insist on calling them, lifts? Now, this story is a little bit of an urban legend. I've heard a couple of different versions of this. In some versions, it's a hotel. In other versions, it's a commercial building, but the story is essentially the same. And it goes that people were unhappy waiting for the lift, that the wait times were excessive, and that they were actually thinking about leaving the building. And this became a huge problem, so much so that the hotel management called in an engineering firm, and the cost of making those elevators actually quicker was completely prohibitive. They could not afford to do that. And it was a junior member of staff that had just been hired and was a psych graduate who suggested that maybe the problem wasn't the slow lifts, it was just that people were bored. And he or she decided to put in some mirrors so that while people were waiting, they could occupy themselves, checking their own reflection, checking their appearance, looking at the other guests. And it worked. And still to this day, if you go to a lobby of most hotels or buildings that have lifts, there is a mirror there. And there's normally a mirror inside the lift as well. I don't know how true that story is, but it seems like something that would have happened. Now, a change in virtual location for my second story. And through the magic of editing, we're now in a fake airport. Airport was getting a lot of complaints about the wait times for baggage, but only on one specific flight. And they couldn't figure out why the wait times were no longer than on all the other flights. Um, but for one reason or another, there seemed to be a lot of complaints from this specific flight. So they looked into the problem, and what they found was that this particular flight always came into a departure gate that was quite close to where the baggage was. So there was only a 1 minute walk to the baggage and then a 5 or 6 minute wait for bags, which I think is quite quick. And so what did they do? They decided that the plane should land at the other side of the airport. The passengers then had a 5 minute walk to the baggage claim and then a 1 minute wait for their bags. So exactly the same amount of time had taken place, but complaints went down. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You could understand that while they are active in walking and getting to their destination, they don't perceive themselves to be bored. Let's do one last quick change of scenery. And now we find ourselves in fake Disney World. If only I could have the budget to go to the real one. And you can imagine this is a very, very busy place. Crowds are only going up throughout time. And people do not like waiting in line for the rides. It's a huge problem that Disney's always had to deal with, especially as attendance has actually been climbing throughout the decades. And so what did they do? Well, back in the 80s, they had a three-step program, and it was pretty simple. One was people shouldn't wait more than 15 minutes for a line. Unfortunately, in many cases, that's not going to happen. So if people have to wait more than 15 minutes in the line, the idea was, one, to hide the queue out of view. So simply by not being able to visualize how long the wait was, they found that people were generally happier. So not only did they put the queue typically indoors and behind something and make it a themed area, they also section it off so that you can't sort of see around the corner and see how long that particular queue is. And they found that this made people generally happier to wait. And the third was the queues themselves. As I said, they were highly themed. There's animatronics. If you've ever been to Disney World, you'll know that the queue is very much part of that experience. And so the complaints about queues went down quite rapidly. And then in the early 90s, they invented this system called FastPass, which is basically a virtual queue. And something very interesting happened with this. So if a queue was, for example, 40 minutes for a ride, you would get a paper ticket that would let you come back in 40 minutes. So your actual time of waiting to get on the ride is exactly the same. But instead of having to stand in a queue for 40 minutes, you can then go off, do other things, buy food, go on other rides. And they found that guests were able to go on 50% more rides with this system, the guest satisfaction was a lot higher, and it also meant that some of the less popular rides got a bit more love and attention. And so, once again, we have a situation in which the actual wait to get on the ride is the same. Nothing has changed, but people's perceptions and happiness has. Let's go back to the virtual office. Waiting. In all three of my stories, the wait time actually didn't go down at all. The people waiting for the elevator, the people waiting for their baggage, and the people waiting for the rides, they all had to wait exactly the same amount of time. The only thing that changed was their perception. In most cases, a little bit of entertainment meant that they didn't mind waiting at all. And it's important to bear this in mind when you're thinking of speeding things up because people are unhappy or narrowing down wait times. That's not always the first solution. In today's world, we often think about things being on demand and being so quick. We think, hey, if they can deliver in 5 days, let's deliver in 3. If they can deliver in half an hour, let's do 15 minutes. But that has a very high operational cost associated with it. And let's not forget, especially if you're in some sort of last mile delivery business, that your business is resting on the shoulders of people that don't have any skin in the game. They're not employees of your company. They don't really care if they do a bad job because they're only making a couple of pounds off of that transaction. And so you're weighting your company's reputation on the backs of delivery people simply to save a little bit of time. In most cases, if you set a clear indication of when things will happen, people are happy with it. And of course, the old tricks work the best. Tell somebody it's going to be 3 days and deliver in 2, and they will be happy. And so, waiting. If you're a business that has some sort of waiting involved or delivery times, how do you deal with that? And what is the best way of setting expectations and then exceeding them? Thanks for watching. Tune in next week.